So I went off-road and it was climbing for a good couple hours. And all of a sudden it kind of went from highways and farms to I almost seemingly went over this hill, and there was just these space-age plants as far as the eye could see. And I remember just cycling through this otherworldly universe almost as you curved around these hills and these plants that I'd never seen before. There had been a few landslides, so there was no cars, there was nobody. It was just me in this landscape. It was super misty, and yeah, I felt like I was cycling through a film set. It was crazy.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, James Benson-King. James set off in 2022 for a huge bicycle adventure, one which would take him all the way from Alaska to Ushuaia. A complete traverse of North and South America, culminating in over 31,500 kilometres of riding and taking over 1.5 years to complete. But this wasn't just a pure cycle tour. James had many side quests, as he would call them, along the way, which would allow him to go explore the road less travelled and see more of the countries he was cycling through. I've often commented with other guests who have taken a similar journey that this route exposes you to every type of geological landscape imaginable. And it's fair to say that James experienced the raw beauty of these two continents to the max. Since returning home to the UK, James has continued to ride his bike and take on new adventures. He's also assisted others in embarking on their own bicycle challenges and is now transforming himself from a long-distance touring cyclist into dabbling into the world of ultra cycling races. He's set himself a goal of cycling across Antarctica, and very shortly he will be taking off for a bike tour through Europe. To some degree, it's fair to say James's bike adventures really haven't stopped, and I'm looking forward to delving into some of the backstories that lay behind these. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Bella.
Listeners, if you think that James is familiar, it is because I have shared an anecdote of James's tour before in our midweek mini episodes of one day of his trip. And James, I can't wait to hear so many more stories because I know you'll be full of them. But a question that I start my show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, James, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
I do. I had to prepare for this because I've listened to a few of the podcasts before. I knew this question was coming up. And my memory of the bike and the actual bike itself are very different. I found the picture. I thought it was a very manly camo bike that I learned to ride on, but I re-looked at the picture and it looks like it's a Woody from Toy Story themed bike.
Oh, I love it. I love it. You so need to send me that photo. I've had a few guests send me photos of their first bikes, and it's quite cool to think that there's people who still have them. How old would you have been?
I think I was about 6 or 7. I'm in full camo for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but yeah, so I'm in full camo on a Woody bike.
I love it. And a British accent there. This is in the UK?
Yes, yeah. I lived up north. Was born in Crewe.
Wow. And so did you ride bikes a lot as a kid?
I think I did. I come in waves. Bikes come in waves in my life. So that was, I think the picture was taken the day I learned to ride. And then throughout my teenage years, I used bikes to basically get wherever I was going. I lived 10 to 15 miles away from all of my friends. So if I ever wanted to see anybody, I had to ride to them. And then it kind of dropped off throughout university through my traveling years. And then I picked it back up again after I returned back from living in Australia.
Oh, I don't know how I didn't pick up that you have lived in my home country. Whereabouts were you living when you were in Oz?
I flew, so I did a backpacking trip after I finished university. Did about 6 months in Southeast Asia, ran out of money, and then flew to Western Oz. I lived in a place called Meriden and worked on a farm there, which is about 3 hours east of Perth. bought a Land Cruiser and then drove the whole of the south coast all the way across to Sydney, up the east coast, and then lived in Sydney for 6 months as well.
I know that I won't be the first Australian that will have said this to you, but you have most likely seen more of Australia than I have seen myself. It's a country full of contrasts, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I loved crossing it. Was just incredible, seeing like some of the rainforests up in the north to the Nullarbor, just the absolute plains. It was crazy. And of course the beaches.
You weren't a cycle tourer then, taking big bicycle adventures. Has your mind ever thought about cycling across Australia since?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Watch this space.
Yeah, watch this space. I mean, I had this idea in my head of the Alaska to Argentina trip when I got there. But because I'd never visualized what it was like to travel by bike, I kind of couldn't piece it together in my head yet. But as I was crossing the Nullarbor, I met and saw a few cyclists there, and I could start to see and feel what cycle touring was like. So the idea was there.
Listeners, this was not on my question theme list for James, but I do want to go here. If you were to transport yourself to Australia for a cycle tour there, do you have any feel of where you would go and what you would tour? Would you do like the circumference tour of like the mainland of Australia and a bit of a side trip to Tasmania? Would you go up through the middle, through the outback, go down some of the more rugged, really off-road routes? Like, have you thought of it that much?
I haven't, and I think part of me's the endurance side of it's coming in now. So I think the first thing that comes to head would just be to do like a Perth to Sydney and see what kind of time I could set. An Italian cyclist who I admire greatly recently did it in, I think it was 19 days.
Are you thinking of Omar Di Felice?
Yes, yeah.
I met Omar when he was going through Canberra on that journey. So, yeah. Yeah, I was back home briefly at that stage. And no, I stayed there and saw Omar through. So, yeah.
Oh, what a guy. No, he's...
massive. Potentially future podcast guest. Just put that out there.
I love that as well.
It is a mega crossing. And in fact... we should. I've actually interviewed a couple of guests who've set world records through Australia. One of them is Christina Rivers, who has set the female record for the Perth to Sydney crossing as well. So you may want to check her out. And if you're in for a really long ultra endurance record, check out Lisa Ashford, because she set, again, it's the women's record in this case, for the circumference of Australia.
See, I don't know.
Yeah, that one's quite challenging.
Yeah.
Setting it as a record, from what I gathered from both of their stories, the real tough dynamics of that, especially with Lisa, was also the whole record keeping for the record and the stringent rule sets and stuff like that of where they had to be and support crew. And so it wasn't so much logistics just for her, but it was logistics for a whole support team. And she had major flooding up north with huge road closures, which meant lots of different things too. But anyway, listeners, let's keep our eyes peeled at something in James's future. But I want to know then, James, obviously as a backpacker through Southeast Asia and then time in Australia as well, travelling, you've obviously always had a passion for travel?
Yeah, I think it started when I was about 14. I moved down south from where I lived in the north of England down to where I live now in Bournemouth. And when I started in school, the school that I moved into would hold rugby tours every 2 years. And so I was desperate to go on this rugby tour. It was to South Africa. So I would be 16 when the tour left. But at 14, that was when they started to bring the team together to go. And I remember receiving kind of the information about it and saying it was £2,000, and my parents being like, look, we can't afford that. But they didn't say I couldn't go. They said we can't pay for it. And so I took that as I need to find this money. I will do anything to go. And so from the ages of 14 to 16, I was doing anything and anything to try and save money. And I think that has instilled this passion within me that the first big trip I ever went on was paid for by myself, and I loved it. So ever since then, I've been earning to pay for travel, basically.
That rugby trip, it wasn't so much about playing rugby in South Africa. It was more about facilitating you being able to go and explore a new place.
I mean, it was definitely about playing rugby. I was a 16-year-old playing in an 18-year-old's team, so I wasn't getting all of the game time. But for me, it was all about being with friends, traveling, seeing another country. And I think I just fell in love with travel then, seeing South Africa, playing different games all over South Africa with all my best friends. It was incredible.
What a mega trip to take at 16. And then obviously, as you said, Southeast Asia, Australia. I want to know then, there's differences to seeing a country on a rugby tour, differences to backpacking your way after schooling and education to, taking a car, a Land Cruiser or whatever across Australia, a motorised trip. What pushed your mind towards bike travel?
So whilst I was backpacking in Southeast Asia, I met a man named Simon, who his cycling moniker I think is the Pedaling Panther, and he's now completed his world trip. But when I met him, he was about halfway through, and I met him in a random hostel, and I was like looking at his bike. He had a map out. I was like, "What is going on here?" And started talking to him. And after we went out for dinner, and I think it was there that he was like, "You can do this too." And I think somebody else telling me like this grand idea of travel, I think we put cycle touring on like a big pedestal if you've never done it before. And he was like, yeah, you can do it. And ever since then, the idea was in my head of bike travel and doing something. And I saw him then cycle from Alaska to Argentina. And I was like, that's the trip. That's what I want to do.
So did you take smaller beginner trips to ease into it, or did you go straight to that's the first big cycle trip that you're taking and you're going out there fresh with a zest and curiosity to explore the world in this way, but as a pure novice?
It was essentially novice. So I did a few things back in the UK. So I finished my time in Australia, moved back to the UK, and then I started pushing myself a bit more. So I think I'd done 2 bike tours before that, both in the UK. One was about 5 or 6 days. The other was Land's End to John O'Groats, which was about 11 days. But I think the first time I wild camped with my bike was in Alaska. Yeah, there was a lot of firsts at the start of the trip.
Okay, actually, how much time had passed from chatting about you could do this too and go on a cycle tour too to actually rocking up and being able to take off in Alaska?
So I met Simon in January 2017 and I left in July 2022, so 5.5 years.
Would that have obviously been quicker had the pandemic not shut the world down?
I think it would have been a bit quicker. I returned in 2018 and was planning to save for a year and go in 2019. But yeah, I guess COVID came around and promotions at work and things got in the way.
Did you spend a lot of time cultivating like a detailed type of route or places? Like, were you putting together in your mind places and milestones of things you wanted to see and experiences you wanted to have? Or was it purely, I'm starting in Alaska, I'm ending up at the very tip in Ushuaia of South America there at the bottom of Chile, and how I get there is, let's see how we go?
Completely see how we go. I knew I wanted to do the Dalton Highway and I knew I wanted to finish in Ushuaia. So I knew it was north to south. I knew it was the most northern point to the most southerly point. But apart from that, it was, wherever.
That thought of like not being so fixed on a specific set route, I always feel that must suit you so well, because it's one thing I feel figuratively you really need to pack a lot of into your panniers when you go on a route this big, is that concept of flexibility, because so much happens that just you could never plan for that would change the next day, the next week, and everything as well, won't it? You will have known this. You're nodding your head in knowing that experience yourself, obviously.
Yeah. You have to be. I think cycle touring in general, you have to just be so accepting of changes and setbacks, and you have to just accept them as it's growth. It's part of life. And I think my favorite thing that I kept, like a little thing that I would think about on the trip, was that without these setbacks, I'm not growing as a person. If this was easy, the trip would all be the same. And so I was viewing setbacks as opportunities to kind of grow and get better. Although sometimes that's tough.
Was that a mindset that you took on at the very start of your trip? Like you had that within yourself and that self-awareness that you needed to have that mindset? Or was that something that you really cultivated sort of midway or partway through?
It started in Canada, I think. I was reading a book at the time called The Four Agreements, and I started to cultivate this mindset then. And I definitely got stronger throughout the trip. I would start thinking of trying to think of headwinds as opportunities to grow. which at the start is very difficult. You can't see the positive. But by the end, I knew it was shaping me into a new person, helping me grow.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I feel you can't take a journey so long and so deep without it sort of shaping and changing you as a person as well. Just because you experience so much. You experience so much on a cycle tour in a day, yet alone a year and a half.
Yep.
I get the joy, James, of speaking to you now for, just over an hour, but I feel like we're only even going to touch on the very, very tip of what you've experienced in that time as well. Something I did want to ask you, though, it doesn't really have anything, I don't think, to do with this trip, or maybe it does, but it is something I discovered. So your moniker is the Biking Viking, and I really want to know what that's about and how that came to be.
It's actually some people from your country, from your land. So
I thought it might have been an Aussie thing.
I worked in construction when I was in Sydney, and the show Vikings was very big at the time. I think this was 2018, 2017. And so all of the construction workers would call me Ragnar, and I would get free drinks in bars from people coming up to me and talking to me about the show. My close friends in Sydney, I was the Viking. And then I was traveling with two, can't remember where they were from, I think two Irish girls in my Land Cruiser. We were driving up north, and we were talking about this trip in Alaska to Argentina, and that I needed kind of a name or an Instagram handle. And they said, well, we call you the Viking. Why don't we call you the Biking Viking? And at the time, my mind exploded, and I was like, nobody's ever thought of that ever. That is a brand new name. And then once I started trying to do it on social media, you see that a lot of other people have done that as well.
I was going to say there's no trademark then.
Yeah. So that's where the name came from.
And then something else I want to ask you. So listeners, you don't have the beauty of video here, but I do have the benefit of seeing James in his room. And what I love, and I said this to him before I pressed record, is there's a big world map there. There's also along his ceiling is a string of flags that he has travelled through. And then just further off in the background are all the number plates that he managed to come across during his traverse of North and South America. Now, James, I have seen, it's almost like the tradition of people taking a nude photo in the Salar de Uyuni. There seems to be a bike touring tradition of number plates, and I have no idea why. Can you enlighten me on this?
I can't tell you why either. I think it's the same reason that the Salar de Uyuni started. Somebody probably did it, and then everybody else started. The only reason I did it was because my friend before me, the Pedaling Panther, did it. I saw his pictures. I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, so I need to do that as well. Yeah, the first Alaska plate I saw, I grabbed it, put it on my bike.
And like, where do you even get these? Like, are you just happenstancing on one on the road? Are you going to like a wrecking yard? Like, I don't have a concept of like just seeing number plates. Maybe I'm just not looking for them.
So I found I was very annoyed because I found two Alaskan license plates, but neither of them were motorbike sized, and the normal plates are just they look a bit silly on a bike. So I was expressing my concern to my friend when I was in Fairbanks in Alaska, and because I hadn't found one, I'd been to a few wreck yards, I couldn't find the motorbike license plate, so he went and bought me one, and I figured I haven't found it, but somebody else has bought it for me, so it's okay.
Did you have any other little mementos along the way other than the number plates? Like some people take like a little charm or a good luck thing or something. I realise this sounds like a ridiculous question, but I do want to go there. Did you have something with you as well?
Yeah, I've got I don't know what you'd call them, like a little toy model that my team gave me before I left. So that the company that I left, my team bought me a gift, and it's a luchador. It's like a bobblehead luchador.
I've seen those bubblehead model things before. Where was he, like in a pannier? Did he sit on a handlebar? Like,
oh, he was strapped to the pannier rack at the front of the bike. He leads the way.
I love it. The adventures that he has. I could do a podcast with him. With a journey that is so vast and so big, something I've often also wondered is, you're going to be going through a lot of extremes of landscapes, which obviously bring with them extremes of climate and weather and temperatures, hot, cold, wind, snow, rain, the mix. When you decide to go on this journey, did you factor in stuff like the weather in terms of where you wanted to be at what times of the year? So
I started and was delayed. My bike got lost by an airline for a month, but I was immediately delayed by a month. So that put me at risk because I was like, now I'm starting the Alaskan autumn, which very quickly turns into winter. So I started my trip at a bit of a delay. And it began as a race against winter. That's what it was in my head. And a few times would cycle over mountain passes and then hear about snow a few days later behind me. So it was on my boot heels. But once I'd kind of crossed that and headed into America and the West Coast, I forgot about the weather a little bit until I got to Colombia. And that's when people started talking about the rainy seasons, which are a bit more serious down there. And then weather became very much a hot topic in terms of when I should start riding and where I needed to be by when.
Yeah, I have to say, I almost felt ignorant of this idea because when I think of rainy season and wet season, I think of, Southeast Asia, or I think of very far north tropical Queensland and Northern Territory in Australia, or I might think of places in West Africa. But for some reason, I have never thought of places in South America. Don't know why. Listeners, it's ignorance. And it was actually through, I think it was watching a YouTube channel. Oh, I want to say it's a Dutch guy, Martin. I'm probably going to butcher your last name. Doulard, I think it is. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about. He's written some amazing books. 2 Years on a Bike was the one that he had done, an amazing YouTube series. Listeners, you definitely want to check it out. It's fantastic. And he found himself in South America during rainy season. And my gosh, it looks absolutely biblical, like what he experienced there. Did you have rainy season experiences then, or?
I can switch on the boosters sometimes and really truck through places. So I never had the worst of it. I've never had to stop because of the rain being so bad. I've always toughed it out. But there was a few storms that I got caught in that put me through the ringer. But for the large part, I never had back-to-back days of rain. I managed to kind of avoid the worst of the seasons.
What was the worst of the weather for you to have to endure through? What's your worst type of weather? And I'm not going to say wind is on any day, so wind's not allowed.
Wind's not allowed. I think the worst the weather got, there was a snowstorm up in Alaska as I went through a mountain pass, but that wasn't that scary. I don't know whether I was a bit naive at that point of the trip, but it didn't scare me too much. But the weather in the Peruvian Andes, I was on the shoulder season, so the rainy season was starting to creep in and was racing against it a little bit. And a few of the storms that rolled through the mountain passes really scared me, just because you feel so exposed up there. It's like 4,500 meters, and the clouds get angry.
Yeah, and I don't know that anything really prepares you for that much constant time at that level of elevation. I've never been that high in my life. Like you said, the word vulnerable, I feel like a change in weather, stuff gets real really quickly and can get serious really quickly then, can't it?
Yeah. Because the other thing is I was setting off super early in the day to try and beat the storms, because you know that they were going to roll through normally around 2-3 p.m. But there was a few times where I would only be 3/4 of the way up the pass, and you'd see the clouds start to roll in. And you have to decide, am I going to roll the dice, see if I can make it up and descend? And a few times I'd pitch up my tent and just be waiting for the storm to roll through, and nothing would happen. You stay there for the night, and then other times you try and push through, and that storm just starts coming down. And then you feel horrible on the descent because you're soaking wet, and you have to make that decision.
Pushing through and getting soaked in that and being out in the elements would have to be worse. But I wonder mentally, was it also a hard burden if you set the tent up and everything was fine? And did you ever sort of have those moments of, I should be out there, but I'm not? And were they hard to deal with too?
Massively. If anything, that's worse for me. If you know me, that's my worst nightmare. Not being able to keep going, but I'm just stuck in my tent. That's horrible.
Why is that?
I don't know. I think there's a pilot syndrome. I'm going to butcher this explanation, but when pilots are coming into land in bad weather, what normally happens is if there's a row of pilots all coming in, they will all continue landing until the first pilot decides it's too dangerous and they pull away. And then every pilot after them pulls away because they're like, it's too dangerous now. And I think that's how I live my life, but I'm every pilot. So I'm I just want to keep pushing until it is definitely too dangerous. And then I'm like, right, okay, we'll stop now.
It's sort of like taking things to the extreme and to its limits.
Yeah.
But having the wisdom within yourself to know when you need to back it off.
Exactly. I'm a bit of a bull in a china shop at times. So I haven't tweaked it just yet. I don't know when that perfect moment is.
you're really self-aware of that. Is it something you're working on, or you've just accepted that's you? Like, are you trying to not be that person at the same time and be zen through that, or you just not that's how James is? If you want to push the limits and not feel like you've pushed the stop button when you could have kept going.
It's one thing I learned on the tour, that I forgave myself a lot more for things. I was very hard on myself in, I call it my like previous life, but my life before the trip. And slowly throughout the trip, I stopped being so hard on myself. Like sometimes I like to race on the bike and set myself challenges and push myself. And I would see other cycle tourers taking it really easy, doing 30, 40-mile days. And I thought that's what I wanted to be doing. And so I'd be very hard on myself and say, like, slow down and do that. But I can't, that's not how I live life. And I think towards the end of the trip, I realized, even midway, that I just started forgiving myself. Like, it's not how you do things. You do things a different way. If you want to push yourself, go push yourself. Unfortunately, I don't think I will ever be able to not be a bull in a china shop. I like to go and get things done.
It's something I've learnt through the benefit of interviewing so many people is no one's experience of a bike journey, it doesn't matter if it was the exact same route, is exactly the same, because everyone has their own style and there is no right or wrong way. It's almost like, should a touring bike have drop handlebars? Should it have flat handlebars? Should you tour lightweight? Should you have the classic full pannier setup? Should you have, bikepacking bags? Should you do 10-hour days? Should you do 3-hour days? Like, there is no right or wrong answer, is there?
There's literally, for me, there's only one similarity between everybody, and that's we all have like a love of adventure. That's whenever I'm selling a bike tour to somebody, it's you will have an adventure, and it's your adventure. It's what you make it.
It's something I've often thought about with the word adventure is, what does that word actually mean for people? So if I was to ask you the question, James, what does adventure mean for you? What would your answer be to that?
What does adventure mean to me? I guess for me, it's a very personal feeling. It's like a little flutter. So for me, it's like a goal mixed with fun almost. So I know I'm working towards something and I know I'm excited about it. The big difference I got when I came back home was that I thought I just loved cycling. So I started trying to join cycling clubs and go and do local routes. And I realized I do like cycling, but I find it very hard to get motivated for that. But the minute I say I'm cycling to Amsterdam, or I'm going to try and cycle to London in a day, or I'm going to go visit my family up north, the minute there's the extra thing, the minute I get on the bike, my heart rate, increases a bit, and it's like, oh yeah, we're doing something. So for me, it's the goal mixed with doing something I love, cycling, mixed with it being fun as well.
Is there also an added element for you of the outcome? Well, not necessarily. I was going to say is that the outcome sometimes is unknown. I know, and I want to talk about this later in the show, you've started, since you've gotten home, dabbling in the idea of ultra cycling and potentially, ultra cycling races and stuff like that. I've done one, and so I knew for me when I signed up, there was a lot of effort and a lot of training just to get to the start line. But then, and I had it in my own self that my mantra was, if I got to the start line, it had been a success because the rest of it's unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. And so is there an element of the unknown being something that drives you as well, do you think, for that sense of adventure?
Definitely. I think that's what comes with, if I'm going to do an 80-kilometer loop with my friends on a Saturday, you roughly know the route, you roughly know what's going to happen. But if you're cycling to Amsterdam, which I start tomorrow, I've got no idea what's going to happen. I've got a rough idea of who I might see and who I might stay with, but who knows what will happen along the route? Who knows who I'll meet? It's definitely the unknown. You've nailed it.
I think there's a couple of different modes that people take on a bike adventure, tour, bikepacking, whatever you want to call it, with. And there's people who need their itinerary fully planned out. So they need to know where they're starting and where they're stopping. Maybe sometimes where they're even to the degree of, this is my start town, this is my finish town, and these are the roads I'm taking. And then there's people who have like that GUI of an idea of, well, I've got a week or 2 weeks to get to Amsterdam and I'll figure it out along the way. So you're very much in the latter camp. But did you ever start out in the former? Did you ever need more of the detailed plan?
So I do make detailed plans, but that is mainly a week at a time. So for instance, for Amsterdam, I know where my friends are, and I know that tomorrow I'll ride to Brighton, the day after Dover, and then from Calais I'll go to Ghent. And so I roughly know where I am. And for me, it's the challenge is like pushing myself along the way. So I would never, I think I'm a little bit of camp A, a little bit of camp B, and that the long plan is never really determined, but the plan to the next big waypoint is definitely planned.
Okay. And so did you have sort of like a week at a time planned from when you set off at Alaska? Were you sort of doing things along that way, or was that more flexible? Like, did you even have like an end date to get to Ushuaia by?
No, I didn't have an end date. That was on purpose. That's how I like doing it, yeah.
That's called freedom, isn't it?
Yeah, that is, yeah. You and the road.
But okay, so end date aside, what about was it getting through each country? Like you said you were detailed. Did you develop detailed sort of semi-routes along the way? Or you didn't know what you didn't know?
I'm trying to think of an example. So let's say when I stopped in San Diego with a few friends for like a few days. And so from San Diego, when I crossed into Mexico, I would have a plan pretty much all the way down to La Paz. But maybe for the next week, I'd have a detailed plan of where I'm thinking of like camping every night, something like that. So for maybe 700, 800 kilometers, I know roughly where I'm going to sleep or where I'm thinking about sleeping. That can all change, obviously, with whatever happens. And then I know where the next big city that I'm going to kind of stop and do a big resupply is. That's kind of how I do things.
What about things like milestones and markers? What were the key places and things you wanted to experience from this trip?
That is completely, yeah, I didn't have any kind of, they all hit me as they hit me. So a big one for me was crossing into Mexico, because I think that was the first non-English speaking country. And so it became like a massive challenge. And when I didn't know any Spanish before I crossed in. So when I started learning Spanish and being able to communicate with people, that was a big milestone. I think in terms of distances, it finally hit me when I crossed into Panama and crossed into Panama City that I'd finished a continent. That was a big one. And then the next one after that was, I think, Peru when I hit Cusco. I had a big book when I was a kid about the Incas, and Cusco was like a big deal to me of cycling through there. So that was a big milestone as well.
You know how in my intro I was saying travelling that route, you're going to go through every form of geological landscape that there is, and you're going to experience that. I imagine that there's so much joy as well, James, from the fact that you're discovering things that were new to you, that you didn't know potentially existed. Like, there's major markers, there's Machu Picchu, or there's the Salar de Uyuni and Torres del Paine. I always pronounce that wrong. But you know where I'm talking about, Route 40 or Patagonia or something. There's markers that we know about. But then there would have been so many things that you just didn't even know existed, and you're experiencing there for the first time.
Yep. I think the biggest one of them for me was in Ecuador, when I kind of crossed into Ecuador, and then I had two friends, Susie and Ed, who are listeners as well.
Hi, Susie and Ed.
And they had told me they were very good at knowing my style of riding and giving me like routes of where I could go, because they'd been ahead of me the whole time. And so they told me, they were like, you'd really enjoy this particular path away from the road. So I went off road, and it was climbing for a good couple hours. And all of a sudden it kind of went from highways and farms to, I almost seemingly went over this hill, and there was just these space age plants as far as the like I could see. And I remember just cycling through this otherworldly universe almost, as you curved around these hills and these plants that I'd never seen before. There had been a few landslides, so there was no cars, there was nobody. It was just me in this landscape. It was super misty, and yeah, I felt like I was cycling through a film set. It was crazy.
I know I'm an empath, so I always feel a lot of the stuff that my guests say, but I actually got goosebumps thinking of what it would be like to be there. Like, it would just be this foreign landscape that you feel you've got it all to yourself, and it's just all brand new to you and totally unexpected.
Yeah, out of nowhere. Susie and Ed kept that one to themselves. They just said I'd like it.
Nice one. And it's amazing because I often think one of the best things of taking a journey like this is also the new friendships you make along the way with other bike travelers that you meet, in some going the same direction, some you're crossing paths and you're swapping stories with. And I also think, the benefit with running a show like this is sharing your story, James, and sharing your experiences. It's people listening now that are thinking, ooh, Ecuador. And they're going to be looking for this and seeking it out as well. But you'll also be thinking of those, future travellers and thinking, wow, there's someone that's going to be experiencing something here or there or whatnot. I noticed you've had some dreamy wild camp spots. One of them that I came across was volcano views in Guatemala. And again, listeners, I'm learning so much about the world as I host this show, but I feel ignorant saying this out loud, but I'm going to own it. I didn't realise there were volcanoes in Guatemala. That's how ignorant I was. Tell me about this wild camp, because I read your post and I saw pictures of it on Instagram, but I really want to feel what it was like there.
So this was another Susie and Ed tip. They told me I should go.
Hang on, I need Susie and Ed, if you're listening to the show, hello, and get in touch with me. I might need to interview you.
They're a wealth of knowledge, those two. I love them. So they told me, they gave me a complete rundown of how to hike up this mountain yourself, because what can happen is I think the tourist companies charge like $100, $150 to take you up there, but it is legal to go and hike up there yourself. So they told me what I needed to do. I left my bike at the bottom, rented a backpack, and it's one of the steepest hikes I've ever done. It's pretty much just vertical, I think from about 2,500 to maybe 3,750 meters. And the whole time you can kind of hear this noise in the background. And I wasn't sure what it was. It was loud, but not too loud, like whistly. And I didn't really know what it was. As I'm hiking up, there's dogs coming with me on the hike. I had a few friends to support me along the way. And as you get closer, the noise gets louder and more clear, but it was so misty and cloudy that I couldn't see what it was. And I later found out it was the volcano erupting. But because you can't put the two together, you couldn't see it. I had no idea what it was until this another hiking couple told me. And so Susie and Ed had given me a spot where to camp, so I found the spot they were talking about. I set up my tent in complete cloudiness. I had no idea where anything was. And then I just sat back and relaxed, waiting for the clouds to clear. And then all of a sudden, I think it was about 3-4 p.m., the clouds just parted, and I just had this, front row seat to Volcan de Fuego, which erupts roughly every 15 to 20 minutes, spewing a bit of ash and molten rocks. And the noise it gives off and the view that it gives is crazy. But the highlight of the show is you hike up at 4 a.m. in the morning to the top of Acatenango, which is the volcano you're camped on, looking over. And when you get to the peak, you're a tiny bit taller than Volcan de Fuego. So you can see the molten rocks at night spewing up, which is just incredible. Yeah. You can't see it in the day because the sunlight kind of blocks the molten rocks, but at night you can see them coming up.
Wow. Is that like a moment where nature makes you feel about the size of an ant?
Oh, yeah.
Feel the power of nature all around you?
Well, I think it was a week after I left, because the routine eruptions every 15 to 20 minutes aren't that harmful, but they had one that had built up. It was either before or after I was there, I can't remember. And I think it shut down the city a little bit because of the ashfall. Had like a particularly big one built up and erupted. And yeah, you realize that they're not all fun. They're not all every 15 to 20 minutes. Some of them are bigger. You do feel very small.
Did you have like the magic of like an amazing sunrise or a sunset wouldn't it, because you were in the mist, weren't you? But was it a clear sky, or did you have like what the sunrise was like in that spot?
The sunrise was amazing. It was at the top, so I mean the winds up there were incredible. You couldn't hear anything from the winds, but the sunrise, you could see all of the other, because there's multiple other kind of volcanoes all casting shadows, and yeah, stunning up there.
So, you know how I've spoken about my ignorance of not realising, things like wet seasons or, that there were volcanoes in Guatemala. I can't believe I put that out there. But what was something you were totally ignorant about that took you by surprise on this trip?
Oh, so much stuff. I mean, the one thing for me was not planning a route. So people would routinely tell me about things that I hadn't researched at all. So I'd never heard of the Carretera Austral. And people would talk about the Carretera Austral, the amount of conversations where I was like, yeah, I'd just go along as if I knew what they were talking about. Had no idea, didn't know about Ruta 40, didn't know about the Trans-Mexico, didn't even know there was bikepacking routes on the bikepacking.com website. So for me, I'm very ignorant in that way, in terms of I don't research that much. But when you've got friends like Susie and Ed, you can lean back on them.
I love that. Your own bike touring research is well ahead of you there as well. Being totally oblivious of something existing, there's something really awesome about that. This is teeny tiny compared to what we're talking about with your adventure, but a few weeks ago, I went on a very short 4-day bikepacking trip. I needed to get away. I interview people taking adventures all the time, and I don't have a long time, but when I can take a mini break, I do. And I plotted a sort of rough route here in the Southern Pyrenees where I live here in France, but I didn't have a route set. I had full flexibility other than it was only 4 days long. And I remember just the ignorance but pure beauty and serendipity of a moment of just jagging the best possible route on day 3, which took me through gorges that I didn't know existed and took me through these most amazing natural moments of beauty. And I imagine that this would have hit you time and time and time again, James.
Oh yeah, when you don't look ahead, it sounds quite bad. But then when you do actually get there, you're just blown away. A lot of the stuff I'd never seen pictures of before, and you don't know what to expect because you haven't even thought about what to expect. So it hits you. Yeah, I like doing it that way.
Yeah, I want to know then about the reverse, because there'll be times where you have something in your mind, and maybe that's ignorant of me to suggest that you do. But I imagine that you have perceptions of a place that you have heard of when you get there, and I'd love to know where that's changed. So, for example, we were talking about Mexico. That was the place where things changed for you because the language changed, the culture changed, things that were familiar and quite easy became different. You needed to learn how to converse and communicate with people in a different way. But what about your perception of Mexico before you got there, and what was it like when you were there and actually were in Mexico?
So my perception before was, purely based on Western media, I guess. So you kind of think it's going to be more dangerous. You become a bit more protective, I think, and a bit more standoffish. And by the end, I consider Mexico as my second home. There's multiple people that I need to go back and see for hosting me. And I think my favorite story that sums up Mexico for me was I'd cycled up to the top of place called Nevado de Toluca, which is near Mexico City, and hiked up the final, I think it was 300 or 400 meters to the top of this volcano. It's an extinct volcano, this one. And at the top, I came back down and there was a family looking at my bike and taking pictures and having a look. And I ended up having a picture with this guy's son. And he said, if you ever pass through my town, come and visit. So I messaged him, I think it was 2-3 days later. I said, I'm coming through your town. Let me know what your address is and I'll cycle over. I can come say hello. And he was like pinpointing me, and my Spanish wasn't there yet. He was like, you need to be here at 4 p.m. And I don't know if you experienced this as well as a cycle tourer, that when somebody tells you to be somewhere at an exact time, when you're living this free life, I was like, I really don't want to be there. Like, I don't want to have to be there, but fine. Like, I'll make sure I'm there. So I got there at 4 p.m. and was waiting. And I think it was another 15 minutes. I was like, this guy isn't here yet. Like, what's going on? And then over the horizon, I think it was 7 other cyclists came riding up, and they'd come to meet me at the border of their state. They were so proud of their state. They were like, we want to meet you at the border, and then we'll cycle in together. Not only had they done that, Bella, they didn't think the roads were safe enough, so they brought along a police convoy. So we were convoyed
for a little motorcade.
A police van at the back to make sure that no traffic could overtake us. And we had a police motorbike up front to make sure that there was a safe gap in front. And that took us all the way into the town. The family looked after me. They fed me that night. And then the next day they asked me to speak at their school. I was a mini celebrity for like an hour. That to me summarizes the people in Mexico. They are super, super friendly. They want to help you in any way they can. There's like a genuine interest in you. There's a genuine interest in sharing their culture. Absolutely love them.
You know, you were saying about how they fed you. I always joke I can't do an episode of the podcast without talking about food, and Mexican food seems to come up with a few guests of just the variety of flavours and the variety of food. As an Aussie, I've grown up with the idea that Mexican food is nachos, tacos, burritos, fajitas. Tell me about some sort of Mexican food that I don't know exists and your relationship with that food while you were through Mexico.
So I think the one thing that we have an idea of in like the Western world is that there's only one, like you say, it's like tacos, burritos, all of this. But each area of Mexico, like it can change within 100 kilometers completely, the flavor profiles, the meats they use, whatever. And so it's impossible to kind of give you one. But one dish that I would say I'd never heard of, and I don't think anybody, unless you've been to Mexico, you will have tried, is a dish called mole. And so it's effectively normally a piece of chicken or something else with plain rice, maybe some vegetables, and then the mole is the sauce which goes over the top. I think there's around 3,000 types of mole. There's about 7 which Oaxaca treats as very, it's like their favorite 7. Different families will have different varieties, and they have, I think, like upwards of 17 ingredients in, but it's the richest. It's like a little bit spicy but rich, and I have no idea what's in there. Some of them have chocolate and all kinds of stuff, but it's the most tasty thing I've ever tasted. And yet everything on the plate is normally quite bland, and then they just drench it in this sauce. It's incredible.
It's all about the sauce.
Yeah.
I live for sauce in food. So what is it called? Mole?
Mole. Mole. The story behind it is quite interesting as well, in that it was linked to a church that was being visited by a high priest. And so I think the priest of the church told some of the church workers, we need to make this guy something really special. And they went through to like the pantry and they just had like nothing left. So they just threw everything they had in a pan, like all of the herbs and spices. They found like a chicken leg and some rice, and they were just like, there you go, there's the mole on top. We'll see how this goes. And the guy was like, this is the best thing I've ever tasted.
I feel like the best meals are that sort of slap and dash together. What's in the fridge, what's in the cupboard. And it's like this fusion. It'll either be a big hit or a flop, but I love the story of this even more now. Mexico's a huge country though. One of our recent guests, Ali Denham, Ali's been a full-term bike traveller now since 2012. So if someone knows a lot about cycling around the world, Ali's certainly one of them. And he rated Mexico as one of his top countries for a bike traveller to visit. And something he told me was it's so much bigger than we ever give it credit for. Was that something that struck you? Like, how long did you end up spending in Mexico?
I was in Mexico for 4 months, yeah. It was the longest time I spent in a single country, for sure.
And did you have a concept of that going into Mexico, or?
No idea. I thought I'd be done in a month and a half.
Yeah.
I just didn't know how big it was. And I did take a minor detour. I had to race to meet my mum in Cancun. But apart from that, I was cycling at pretty fast pace, and it's a big old place.
And obviously one that you'd like to go back to.
Oh, yeah.
Are you the sort of person that does return back to places? And don't get me wrong, I think everybody does this. People will visit places and it'll fill their heart and they'll think about those places. But there's some people who'll draw to go back to those places over and over. And there's other people who go, well, I like that place, but I've only got a certain amount of time and I wanted to explore new places. Which one are you?
I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I've never found a place yet where I think I could live. And Mexico would definitely be one place I could see. I need to explore it a bit more. But like you said, I have other goals and wishes at the moment. So it's a difficult balance. But in terms of if I could do my job right now that I'm doing in Mexico, I think I would, for sure.
Are there any other countries where you'd say that about?
Argentina was another one that I could see. I think another big country, incredibly vast in terms of landscapes. The people were amazing as well. The food was great as well. Yeah, very similar in that sense.
Again, probably something you had no concept of before the journey.
No.
We've mentioned about how you have side quests and we've talked about you going away on hikes and things like that on this journey as well. One of your other, I don't know if it was a prerequisite, but one of your conditions for this trip and something that you stuck to really strongly was the idea that every kilometre travelled on this journey had to be cycled. as in your route from the start to the finish. What sparked that up? Give me an inkling into the insights behind that whole, I don't know, would you call it a rule? I'm not even sure what you'd call it.
So I think for me, I found out along the way is that a lot of different cycle tourers have different ideals instead of rules, I guess, but different rules to how they want to travel and what's acceptable for them. And for some people, that's I'm just here to have fun. I'll do whatever I want to have fun, and that's fine. I think for me, there was an underlying. This is a challenge. I'm challenging myself, and the challenge was to cycle the whole thing, and so that was underlying. I think as well because the trip I was doing it for charity, there was something in there as well that if I got a bus for 200 kilometers, I'd feel like I'd cheated in a little bit of a way. So one is challenging myself, and the second doing it for charity. And then the third, I think, is how I got into cycle touring through my friend Simon, who, like, I can't imagine him ever, ever not cycling a kilometer either. He would do 100-mile days every day. So that was how I got introduced. Yeah.
Were there ever moments where that was super, super difficult? Like did it make you feel like you missed out on things because you had to do that? Were there opportunities that would have been open to you that you had to say no to because instead of, say, hitching a lift and going somewhere, you had to ride somewhere and miss that?
I think I was going, because I didn't have an end date that I needed to be in Ushuaia by, I think I was going at a pace where I could pick and choose where I wanted to go. I think the only country where I started to feel a bit of pressure was in Peru, purely because I would have liked to have been to, I'm going to butcher how you say it, but Huacachina, which is on the coast, or the Nazca Lines. But in order to do that, you have to descend down from the Andes to the coast. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to descend down and cycle back up.
Oh my gosh, that's called, self-flagellation, right?
So there was a few decisions I made towards the end, but up until Peru, Bolivia, I don't think I missed anything. I didn't feel like by pushing myself I was missing out on anything. And even on the hardest days, I've got I found my passion on this trip for pushing and testing human resilience. I wanted to see where my limits were. And I think throughout this trip, I kind of honed in on that is a passion of mine. I do like pushing myself. I do like seeing what I can do. So I don't think I would change it.
Pushing limits and stuff, often things that really test us and push us, again, I've used the word unexpected things, and I've said it so many times, I'm a broken record on this, but problem solving on a bike tour, it's something else. You know, we talked about packing flexibility, but you also have to pack your problem solving cap because things happen unexpectedly that will push you to your limits. You had a major mechanical which pushed one leg to your limits, really, didn't it? Like, do you want to tell us what happened here?
So I was in Baja, California. So I just entered into Mexico for about a week or so. And I'd started to have a few issues with my left pedal crank. It was wobbling and coming a bit loose. And so I tried to tighten it up and do as good a job as I could. But I think the damage had already been done. And I was riding with my friend Baptiste from France. 1 minute I was pushing with my left pedal crank. And then the next, as I pushed, pedal crank came off, but it was still clipped into my foot. So I had to come off the bike with a clipped in pedal crank still.
Oh my God, I'm just picturing it. Wait, hang on, is the left side, because you know how pedal crank, you've got two pedals and one will go sliding into the bottom bracket. Is the left one not the bit that has also slides in, so you didn't have to slide it out and get it out, obviously?
The pedal and then the crank arm itself had come completely clean.
Whoa.
Bike. And it turns out the thread had been loose for maybe a month, but I hadn't noticed. And so it'd slowly been rubbing until all the grooves had just given way. And so there was no way to attach it on the bike without it just spinning round. I'd already known in my head, I'm cycling every kilometer, so it was only 40k into the next town. I think we had a tailwind as well, so I was like, it's absolutely fine. I'll pedal into this town and we'll sort it out. The whole of Baja, I didn't realize this. I think they're still only on imperial measurements because of the US. And all of the Shimano stuff I had was metric. So I couldn't...
Oh, no!
Any bike gear. There was no bike shops in this town. And all of the screws that I was going to try and use to put in place were all imperial. So we spent 7 hours trying to find some nuts and bolts that I could use that were metric. And we finally found some. And this is this is problem solving at its finest, I think. So we got trimmed off a piece of a Coke can and wrapped it around the spline to make it a bit wider. We managed to put the crank back on, and then we like bolted it in place like super tight, so it was all held in. And I remember pushing off on the bike, thinking I was, clever as anything. I put the tiniest bit of pressure through the pedal, and it just fell off again.
Oh, no.
I realized that all I could do really was rest my foot. That's all I could do. So at least I had a place to put my foot. It wasn't going to be weird, but I couldn't put any pressure through it really. And so with no bike shops, nothing I could do to replace it. The next town was 100 miles away. So I rode to the next town, and they wanted to like take off, like give me this old rusty pedal crank and drivetrain. And I was like, this isn't going to work either. So I just kept on cycling to the next town and the next town, and just never found anything. And I realized about halfway, I'd ridden maybe 300-400 kilometers. I realized, look, I'm going to have to do this all the way to La Paz, I think. The other option was to stop, but I'm too stubborn for that. So I could have stopped and had a part shipped to me and fixed it, but I'm too stubborn. I wanted to keep moving.
You nearly rode like 1,000 kilometres with just your right leg.
No, I think it was 900k total, yeah, with the right leg.
What was the size of your left leg at the end of that?
I got a few comments on the beach. I arrived into La Paz for Christmas, and yeah, there was a few comments.
Like, was there a noticeable difference? Because I mean, your left leg's resting, but you're not putting pressure.
There was.
So you're still taking it through the motion. But I remember I broke my elbow years ago, and I always remember just the shock I had, where within like 4 days, all the muscles in my forearm from not being able to use it, they started looking like an old lady's forearm, and it was like the muscle wastage. Was that happening to your left leg?
Yeah, it definitely slimmed down.
I so need a photo of this, James, if it exists.
It's a bizarre situation. But yeah, the hardest part was starting up again. Once I put the left pedal back in, my left leg was like riding a bike, learning to ride a bike again.
Of course. Wow. Again, something totally unexpected, which is pushing you to your limits, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Was that had to have been the worst mechanical you faced on this journey, right?
There was cracked a rim, but it didn't really set me back. That had to be, yeah, that was the worst mechanical. Yeah.
Problem solving. I love that you had to turn to a Coke can originally, but you would never in your life think that something as simple as imperial or metric.
Yeah, that set us back for like 6-7 hours.
Well, setbacks, flexibility, resilience, all those sort of terms. You took time out in Colombia, which was unplanned as well.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reasoning behind that? Did you just need a mental reset? Was it physically getting over, injuries or illnesses or anything? Like, what drove you to be halted to a stop there?
The long story is that I had Physic cycling shoes, MTB shoes, and the BOA tightener on one of the shoes had snapped. And so I was cycling onwards with essentially a broken shoe. And I'd done that for the whole of Central America after Guatemala. So I think over 3 weeks I'd been riding with this shoe. And by the time I hit Panama, I was having really bad knee pain. And I think just from the slight movement in the shoe, my foot moving in a weird way, had like traveled up and given me knee pain. So by the time I got to Colombia, the knee pain had continued. And so I got to Medellin and I was like, I need to see a doctor to find out what this is. Because it was just, I couldn't straighten my leg fully. There was a lot of fluid around the knee. And it turned out I had tendonitis. It's horrible. And I said to the doctor, what do I do? And he's like, you do nothing for a month. And so I'd kind of had this idea in my head that I would have a continued break, maybe in a big city. I thought that city was going to be maybe Buenos Aires or Santiago a bit later on. I was a bit ahead of myself for the seasons as well. So if I continued pushing, I was going to hit a rainy season along the way anyway. So I kind of figured it wasn't the worst idea just to stop. And so I managed to become a volunteer at a hostel. I was a handyman in a hostel for a month. And yeah, it was I think I needed a mental break as well at the same time. And this provided the perfect opportunity to do that. It was forced, but in a good way, I think.
Speaking to you, James, you sound like you're pretty committed when you set yourself a goal you've got the mindset to reach it, do everything possible to reach it. But you also talked to me about flexibility and changing things if you need to. Was there ever a part of you that considered, you know what, this spot in Colombia is as far as I'm going?
No. I think from the minute I set off, probably the minute I thought about the trip or saw my friend Simon on the trip, I knew I was going to do it and I knew I was going to finish it. So I think even with any setbacks, I knew I wasn't coming back home without getting to the end.
Hey listeners, if you're loving the stories and adventures I'm bringing to you each week, consider supporting Seek Travel Ride by buying me a coffee. Your donation helps me keep the show going strong and bringing you even more inspiring content from our guests. Just head over to the Seek Travel Ride Buy Me a Coffee page. Every little bit helps and is deeply appreciated. Plus, it's a great way to show your love for Seek Travel Ride. I've included a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for being part of our community and for your support. Okay, now back to the show. Because the other thing that cycle touring does, especially on a long journey like this, and we chatted a bit about this before we press record, listeners, was the idea of, James, you get energized by being with a team of people. You were talking about this in a work sense, and you know previously you worked with a team of people, and so the energy you got from that sort of togetherness and going through something together. When you're cycle touring solo, I know we've mentioned about meeting people on the road and friendships made with complete strangers, but ultimately a lot of the time that you're spending is also on your own, in your own head as well, and the emotions that come with that are all the extremes. In fact, I've got a quote from you, and it says, "Cycle touring expands your happiness and sadness spectrum. The highs are so high and the lows are so low compared to life back home. There's been times I've wanted to throw my bike down and give up, and times where I felt like I'm absolutely flying on the bike, and it can change within a blink of an eye as well. It's what makes cycle touring so special." Can you think of times where you were at your emotional limit and on that roller coaster? Like, is there specific days where you felt that spectrum so starkly?
Peru in the Andes, I think, is the biggest contrast, where 1 minute you can be climbing up and completely starved of oxygen. And I've never had a feeling like it as well with altitude, where your problem solving capabilities and your ability to think rationally kind of goes as well. One quote that springs to mind was a few friends, might have been Susie and Ed again, who were telling me that don't never make a decision when you're up the mountain. And I'd been trying to do that. So I was up at 4,500 meters and I was like, this sucks. I don't want to be here anymore. I knew I was going to finish the trip. So I sat there on my mapping app and I drew a route the whole way down to Ushuaia. I spent like hours doing this the whole way down through the coastline. So I was like, tomorrow I will descend down to the coast, to Lima, and then I'm just going to do a beeline the whole way down. And it was purely because of how difficult being up at that altitude was. But the contrast is that the minute you hit the top, and then all of a sudden you're freewheeling down an incredible descent, everything flips on its head and you're having the time of your life. And so the two things can change instantly, just like they do at the bottom when you get to the end of a descent and then you look back up at the next climb you've got to do.
Where I was going with that was, again, you spend so much time on your own, and so you're the person that has to deal with the ups and downs. There's not another person to get energy from or to problem solve with sometimes.
Yeah.
And so were you aware of the fact that things would change? Like you said, you spent hours mapping a route to, like, your get out of jail card. That's it.
Yeah.
I just want to finish this thing and I want to get it done. And then you're on a descent and you're like, this is the best thing in the world. Were you aware at the time that was happening?
Yeah. So Peru, you are correct. In terms of getting that energy from somebody else, Peru was the first time on the trip where I didn't have enough energy to carry for myself. I couldn't get myself back up. I was struggling with illness as well. And I kind of realized in Cusco that I needed another person to bounce off. And although you do get a sense of community from the WhatsApp groups and you can all support each other, I think I needed another rider who rode similar to me. And so my friend Dominic Menard was up ahead in Bolivia, And that's when I decided we partnered up and rode together for a month. So I think there are times on the trip where I realized that I needed to be with somebody and I needed to partner up because of how low I was. But Peru was the first time that happened, I think.
Looking then forward to future journeys, and I can say this, James, because speaking to you and just knowing what I know about you, this isn't the last journey you're taking. You're about to go to Europe, but I feel like bike travel is part of you and there's more adventures to come. And we'll talk about a few of those. But do you then, how do I want to say this? You're someone who sets yourself challenges. A lot of your journeys are about a personal challenge. Can I do this? The unknown. Can I reach this goal? But also you're self-aware, knowing this energy, this emotional, I needed to be with someone. Do you think you would ever set yourself, like, would you be amenable to the idea of doing something vastly huge with others? Say Australia. Would you go to Cycle Australia with someone else?
So I think I learned yes. Is the short answer is yes. I think I learned a different way of doing things when I went to India and was riding with other people. And I remember admitting this to a friend that it was almost like learning to share again as like a toddler. I feel like I was having life lessons from being. I was like, you can ride at like different other people's paces and just have like fun. And they're like, yeah, that's called like cycling with other people. And just I've been riding so long on my own that you kind of you get selfish in a way. You learn to ride at your pace and you stop when you want to stop. But there is absolute beauty in sharing the adventure with other people. So I would definitely consider doing some of these adventures with other people. But there is also another side of me that needs the goal achievement to be a solo effort, if that makes sense. So for some adventures, if somebody suggested that they wanted to come with me, I don't know whether I'd be able to say yes because some of it is personal. Whereas others, if it's a group effort, I would love to.
It would be interesting because I know that you're looking at ultra cycling now. There are pairs categories to those events as well. Would you ever consider an ultra cycle as a pair?
I would. I think that would be really fun. I would definitely consider doing it. I'd need to find the right partner, I think, because there's definitely different levels to how much people push themselves. So I think it would be fun to try and find somebody that you'd partner well with.
Yeah, because I think the challenge there as well is, you know how we were talking just before about the ups and downs on the emotion spectrum on a cycle tour? That definitely happens in ultra cycling. And as a team of two, it doesn't happen. You're not feeling the same feels at the same time. Yeah. Someone's up and someone's down, and that can be a real benefit if you're in a pair because you've got someone to get energy from, or you're the person giving energy to somebody else, and you've got someone else to problem solve. But it can also sometimes be a burden too, can't it? Because you might want to have the best day of your life where you're flying, and then someone feels like they can't even go 30 kilometres today, and you're feeling held back. So that would be a challenge in itself too, I bet.
That definitely. I'm thinking of my time back to Argentina when I was riding with Dom, and he's an ex-pro mountain biker, and so when I was like listing off the kind of distances that I wanted to cover each day, he was at first a bit like, oh, I don't know whether I want to do that, but by the end we'd kind of formed into like an ultra style team where we would shelter each other from the wind. And there's a few days where he was struggling. I think he was dealing with illness. So I would just sit in the wind all day and take the wind for him. And then there was other days where I wasn't feeling great and he would take the wind. And I think a lot of that team stuff is just about communication. We would have to tell each other where we were.
I want to take you back then to this South American journey because I want to know what it would have been like to actually reach Ushuaia and reach the tip. So it wasn't about reaching Ushuaia. Like, that was the end point. And yeah, that's the destination and the journey's happened in between. But what was it like when you're coming and bringing everything to a close? Did you want it to end? Were you ready for it to end? Was it pedaling slower as the days came past because you wanted to stretch it out a little bit longer? Like, how did you feel at the end point?
The emotions, like you're feeling every emotion simultaneously. For me, it was like avoidance. So I sped up because I didn't want to think about the end being there. So I would ride longer days to give myself less time just sat in a camp spot thinking about what was coming up. So I would just like keep riding and keep pushing myself. But then when I finally did arrive, I think a lot of people arrive into Ushuaia. And for those that don't know, the town is here, but I think it's another 20 kilometers along is the national park, which they call the end of the world. And so I basically pulled into Ushuaia. Most people stop there, stay in a hostel, and then the next day they'll carry on cycling down to the park and turn back around. But I had it fixed in my head that I wanted to camp on my last night. I thought that would be a nice way to finish the trip. And so I pulled into the town, grabbed some supplies, and then carried on cycling the final 20K to the end of the world. Had my pictures, had a cold dip in the sea, and then had a nice little camp to myself at the end of the trip. And I think a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the end, and they get to Ushuaia, and then all of a sudden they're in the middle of a town and there's people everywhere, and it's just very discombobulating. Whereas I think for me, I was able to process the end of the trip on my own at a camp spot. I had my final meal was this like a military style pouch with a dehydrated meal in that I'd carried from the start in Dead Horse. And so that was my final meal. And I
got to ask, what was it? What was it?
Oh, mac and cheese. But for 3 people, I think it had like 1,500 calories. It was huge. And I dreamt about that meal sometimes, and it was horrible. It was not good.
Did you hang on, you took that all the way from the start, all the way down. Did you ever need to break in case of emergency?
It was like, if I ever need it, I know it's there. So the bag was battered, but yeah, I never needed it.
Did it taste good?
No, it wasn't very good at all. I think I built it up so much in my head that when I finally ate it, I was like, no.
I often think I've had the benefit of interviewing guests like straight after, like within days of ending a big journey, and I know at that point there is no processing what that's been like for them. Like this, it's still, did I actually do that sort of mode? You're a few months further down from that now. Reflecting back, how do you feel about the whole journey, and what has it taught you? Not just about the countries you travelled through, but what has it taught you about yourself?
I'd say the biggest lesson that I learned is, we touched on it briefly before, is that acceptance. There's a big acceptance of who I am, not trying to hide from who I am, not trying to force myself to be what I'm not. And I think that before the trip, I kind of might have been fighting back against that a little bit in terms of what I enjoy. So I found out what I enjoy doing. I found out what I love doing, and I do them. And I think it gave me this kind of renewed confidence to try and change career paths and do something different and do something that I love. I think I found my passion in pushing myself and that resilience. I want to learn more about that resilience. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I just kind of became generally more at peace with the world we live in. And I'd say as well, a big lesson, and I think a lot of cyclotourists learn this as well, is I call it giving it up to the universe. And it's kind of whatever happens. So if you get a flat tire, you've got a flat tire, so we'll sort it out. And you just kind of, problems and things occur and you shrug them off. It's like, this is what the universe wants right now. So yeah, I'm just going to give it up. And I feel like that happens a lot in day-to-day life. And if you can just shrug things off, it becomes a lot easier.
Is that something that's changed in you? Like, could you shrug things off as easy as potentially you can now before you set off? Like, is that something that's changed? Is that something you've really accepted now?
I was never, I've always been, I think, relaxed, but from speaking to close family and friends, they definitely have noticed a difference in me since I've returned, and that I'm just a lot more relaxed, I think, a lot more chill with things. Yeah.
And I mean, since you've returned, it's not like you've slipped your old skin on and gone into your old life again, is it? Or like, is that even something you could conceive doing?
Again, it was a big lesson. Halfway through, I was like, "There's no way I could ever do that again." And then I kind of was like, you know what? If I have to, then that's what needs to happen. So I'm not gonna not. I'm trying as hard as I can to change career paths and do something I love. But ultimately, if it doesn't work out, then and I have to go back to my previous job, that's absolutely fine. There was certain aspects of the job I didn't like, but I also loved being part of a team. And yeah, I think I've just come to terms with whatever kind of happens.
Before I talk about what you're moving on to next, I do want to take you back to your journey, and I want you to do something which I feel you've already done for the show, but I want to do it for this episode, and I want you to share one day of your trip. James, it can be from any country, it can be any day, it can be a great day, it can be a crappy day, it can be sunny day, it can be rainy, it can be snowy, windy, whatever, but take me and the listeners there, tell us about that day.
So I want to take you to a day in Belize, I think. We'll do what turned into a fun day. And so I'd been in Mexico for 4 months, and I'd become very comfortable with Mexico. I'd become very comfortable with the food, the people, the culture. And so when I crossed into Belize, there's always that feeling when you cross from one country to another that you're a little bit on edge. And I remember you don't yet know how the country works. You're still kind of figuring out the people. And I remember starting cycling in and feeling a bit vulnerable. I didn't feel safe yet. I didn't understand kind of what was going on. And there's a particularly, it's not a problem, but there's a bit of a clash of cultures when it comes to the supermarkets in Belize. So a lot of Belizean business owners need, I think the main funding is from China. And so there's a big clash of people where the Creole people aren't happy with like the owners of the supermarket. And there's just a sense of aggression in the air sometimes. And so I remember I needed to resupply, so I pulled up to a supermarket. And as I got off, there was like a restaurant on the other side of the road, just a little standalone building. And there was people whistling and clapping at me to try and get my attention. And I remember kind of looking over my shoulder and trying to ignore it because I didn't quite know what it meant. And this guy in a thick Creole accent told me not to worry about it. It was just some ladies showing their appreciation of me. And I didn't know what that meant. And I was like, what are they saying? And he was like, they want to know if you want some water. And I was like, well, that's why I've stopped. So yeah, I mean, if they've got water, I'll go over. So I tentatively kind of got back on my bike, and it was maybe 50 meters back down the road. I pulled up to see, who was, couldn't see because they were in the shadow. I wanted to see who was shouting at me. And it was it was like the owner of the restaurant and like 5 of her friends, and they were just asking me what I wanted. And they were gesturing me inside to get out of the sun. They sat me down at a table. They gave me some water. They were asking me if I want food. I'm like, yeah, I'll take some food. So then they gave me some food, and we were just sat there talking. And the Creole accent is a language which was basically designed for unfortunately, the slaves to be able to converse without the slave owners understanding what they were talking about. And so it's English, like the words are technically English, but I had no idea what they were talking about. So they're talking right in front of me in what is discernibly my language, but I have no idea what they're saying. And they're having a whale of a time. Like they're laughing hysterically. And I'm going along. It seems like a fun time. So they're giving me all this food. They're explaining what it is. And the next thing I'm like, here's a beer. And so then I'm having a beer, and it turns out I think it was some Easter celebration, and more people come in. They're explaining like who I am, what I'm doing. We're getting along really well. And I'm kind of looking at my watch, and I realized 2 hours have passed, and maybe 2 or 3 beers have passed as well. And that was when the owner of the restaurant, she was like, do you want to stay? You can stay at my family's house tonight. You don't have to camp. Like there's a bed for you. She was like, but maybe go to the shop and get us a few more beers. I was like, that I can do. So I walked to the shop, and as I came back, they were trying to teach me some of the Creole words, and they were getting me to guess what people were saying. And there was a lot of talk about people asking to marry me. So that was essentially what the big fun was. But the crescendo of this story is that the restaurant owner she mainly supplies the local police force with food. They come over each evening and she cooks for them. And so a bunch of these police officers were in there, and a police sergeant told them that they all needed to go back to work. Meanwhile, she stayed and was having a few more beers with us. And then she asked if she could braid my hair. So there's a picture of me with a beer, a police sergeant in full uniform, and she's braiding my hair.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I need to see that photo.
I've got the picture.
I was not expecting it to go there. I was expecting you to say, and then she asked if she could marry me or something like that, but braiding your hair. The biking Viking with braids. I love it.
So I had French braids for the next few days.
Do you remember any words of Creole?
They were teaching me some bad ones. I won't bring them out loud. But I can't remember. No, I remember some of the bad ones.
I just also, that idea of like someone speaking English, but I have no clue what they're saying. That'd be quite bizarre as well. Again, just one of those crazy moments where I don't know what you're saying, but I feel like it's a happy situation.
That's it. I mean,
I'm not being threatened. It was quite fun.
Yeah. In some of those situations, you have to you're just reading people's faces, and everybody was having a good time. So it was okay.
You know what I was saying? Tell me about a day of your trip. I mean, it was a trip that was 500 and something days. There's so many days, and each one of them would have been memorable for so many different reasons, James. And the cool thing is that nothing will ever take the memories of those days away. Like, you can always reflect back. You know, I was speaking about how you've got a world map there, and you could pinpoint places on that map now and have a story to tell, and that's pretty cool.
Yep.
Something else you've got on your back wall there is a map of Antarctica, and that's pretty significant for you as well. Do you want to let the listeners in on why that's the case?
So it's actually back to Omar. So I was following Omar's journey. My dad sent me across the news story of Omar whilst I was on my trip. And so for some reason, it just struck a chord with me. I think seeing him struggle spurred me on and him overcoming it. And ultimately, he was unsuccessful, but his explanation of the journey was beautiful. And I remember reading it and just falling in love. Like the man is incredible. And he viewed it was almost giving it up to the universe times 100, his explanation of not being able to complete the journey. And so I knew that I wanted to finish mine first, and I didn't know what my next goal was going to be. And I was incredibly fortunate to finish in Ushuaia and get a last-minute trip booked for quite a cheap price to get to Antarctica.
Wow, what an amazing experience and opportunity.
It was awesome. And it also gave me a lot of space. So there's 3 or 4 days where you're crossing the Drake Passage and you're not doing anything. And so it gave me time to process the journey I'd just done as well. And I think the minute I set foot on that continent, I'd kind of processed the prior 4 days, the journey that I'd done. I was like, I want another goal. I don't want to be here without a 5-year goal. And Omar rushed into my head and this continent was here. And I was like, I'm going to do it. And so it was a rush of, I think, adrenaline of being there and the love for Omar and his journey and his explanation. And I was like, I want to try it. I want to do it as well.
And when you say you want to try it and you want to do it, what we're talking about is you want to cycle across Antarctica, which is crazy. And we're talking about Oma de Felice here. I mean, I know this is a side, step here, but speaking about Oma, the transcontinental has just, the finishes are finished now. And by the time this episode goes out, it will have been a little way in the back. But he did line up for that for the very first time and had to pull out. And the beautiful thing with Omar, if you follow his account on Instagram, is exactly what you're saying, James. Like his explanations of the learning straight away. I'm not saying he's not upset that he hasn't been able to achieve something or circumstances have caused him to have to change tact. I think he crashed within the first few hours of the first day, if my memory serves me correctly here.
Yep.
But just his experiences there and his self-reflection. Have you reached out to him? Have you tried to get some intel and all that type of stuff?
I've tried. So I've messaged him directly and I haven't received any response. So Omar, if you hear this, please respond. But I also have a friend at a company who's going to train me for the trip and he knows him personally. So he's trying to get in touch as well.
Brilliant. As I said, I met him in Canberra as he was doing the IndyPack wheel race. And I did say to him at the time, I'd love to interview you. And he did say yes. So I need to follow that up. And if I do, I'll try and connect you as well.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing. Yeah, and so you were talking about, you need a 5-year goal. Are you even sticking yourself to a time frame of when you might even try and do this?
So the rough plan at the moment is for the training to be in January 2025, the first round. I then need a second round of winter training, which would be in January 2026. And then if I can get funding in place, the idea would be to go in October, November 26. That's the rough plan.
You say November 26, and it sounds so far away, but if it's anything I've learned with every year, everything comes by so quickly.
Yeah.
And you've got so many little mini milestones to go with there as well. I know, James, you fundraised for your North and South American journey. I did actually want to ask about that. And it was, oh my gosh, I feel horrendous now for forgetting the name of the charity, but it was like Cardiac Youth, or it's like a...
Cardiac Risk in the Young.
Can I ask, I mean, there's so many amazing charities around the world to align with, but was there a personal connection or a reason why you aligned with this one?
So I had a heart condition I think it got diagnosed when I was 6 years old, and was essentially at a bus stop with my dad and started complaining about palpitations. And my dad was like, right, straight to the hospital, because maybe 4 years earlier, he'd almost died from a similar problem. And so I got diagnosed with the same condition, but in earlier stages. 2 years after that, they attempted the first operation on me when I was 8 years old, on my 8th birthday. And that was unsuccessful. So for the next 8 years, I dealt with this heart condition. And essentially, I would randomly have intense palpitations. So my heart rate, I'd be sat here talking to you, and then my heart rate would go 220, 230 beats a minute, which was painful. You didn't know why it was happening. You couldn't stop it. It was all natural. And so there was techniques that I learned to slow the heart rate and things, but essentially dealt with that until I was 16, and then had an operation. And I'd always wanted to give back, because the hospitals that helped me out and all of the doctors that helped me as a kid really supported me. So I'd always wanted to give back, but I didn't know a charity then. I was still quite young. And unfortunately, the second reason and how I found the charity is that a friend of mine passed away at university from a random heart murmur. And so that's how I found out about this charity. Any donations at the funeral were given to this charity, and I'd kind of pinned that. So I'd done a few fundraisers for them before Alaska to Argentina. And I think even at the start of my trip, I kind of wanted it to be for the charity, but I just didn't know how to do it. And then the minute I kind of landed in Alaska, I was like, no, I'm going to fundraise for it. It's going to all be for Cardiac Risk in the Young.
Such a personal connection there. And so sorry to hear about your friend passing as well. Like, oh, absolutely horrible. I can only imagine. But like I said, there's so many charities in the world that all do great things, but sometimes it's having a personal connection to one which really drives the importance home for you as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely going to be watching this space for Antarctica. It's not like you're setting yourself a goal that's pie in the sky. Like, you're methodical in the idea that this is the goal and this is how I'm going to achieve it. And I really like that about you, James. So I like that structure that you put towards it. Yeah, it's going to be amazing to watch it take course. We might need to connect again somehow and get an update. That would be amazing as well. If people do want to follow along with your journey, though, how are they best placed to do that? Where do you live in social media land?
So my favorite platform, I would say, is Instagram and YouTube. So you can find me at Biking Viking Rides on both of those channels. I also post on TikTok and Facebook as well. It's all the same stuff, but Instagram and YouTube are the main ones. And then I do have a website as well, www.bikingvikingrides.co.uk.
Biking Viking. You've also got a massive flag now too, don't you?
I do. It's here if you want to see. There we go.
What is that? Is it like 50 centimetres by a metre or something?
It's, yeah, what would it be? 5 foot by 3 foot. It's like a metre.
Yeah.
Up, yeah.
Wow.
When I bought that, I didn't read it properly.
What have you decided? Is that going to go on the back of your bike then? Are you going to have it as a flag? Are you going to wear it as a cape? What are you going to do?
It's dragging on the wheel, so I'm a bit worried about it. So I've just put my British flag on the back. We'll cheer on for the Olympics.
Very good, very good. Alrighty, James. Well, it is time to bring the show to a close. I have 3 quick questions to ask you, which I ask everybody to do so. The first one's music related. We haven't actually really talked about music during this episode, so it'll be interesting to see your insights from the song selection. But as a guest, you now get to put a song on the Seek Travel Ride music playlist. Every guest has a song represented there, and it's the song they choose to be the soundtrack to their adventures. Playlist Listeners is on Spotify, Apple Music, and now also on YouTube Music. James, what song are you going to add to the Seek Travel Ride music playlist?
I'm going to add First Aid Kit Silver Lining, which I hope nobody else has picked.
It is on there. I can say that this is your song there as well, or you can have the opportunity to pick another one. I'm trying to remember which guest chose it.
I tell you what, I have another one on queue, which I can pick, which signified the end of my trip, which might be on there as well. Chance Pena, I Am Not Who I Was.
Oh, no, that's not on there.
That's not on there.
And I don't know this song.
It's about returning home and hoping that people will still love you for who you are now.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll add that for you, but every time I listen to the playlist and I hear First Aid Kit Silver Lining, I'll think of your journey there as well. You're one of those lucky guests that gets to choose two. Okay, final two questions. You have a choice to make. One day you can turn one direction on the road and go up a never-ending, knee-breaking, tendon-inducing hill climb, or you can go the other way into a constant, never-ending headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
It's got to be uphill, purely because I'm assuming if we're climbing, that view is just going to keep getting better and better. It's got to. So I think as long as you're going upwards, the pain will be worth it. That's my theory.
And you've had some brutal days in the headwind.
I've had some, yeah. The headwind is by far the worst, I think.
Definitely. Okay, Team Hill Climb. I often think, James, over 90% of the guests easily have picked Team Hill Climb. I always try and word it to see, can I make the headwind sound better? I think the only thing I'll have to do, though, is to say that it's a hill climb, maybe on an indoor training simulator, and there is no view. And I'd be interested to see what people do then.
I would definitely make it more, or like say that the climb is like a 20% gradient, maybe.
I've tried that. That still doesn't work. Yeah. I've even had people. I've even said it even involves hike a bike, and they still pick the climb. All right, we'll leave that one there. Okay, last question for you, James. You have a choice one day. You can choose to cycle 4 hours on your own or 4 hours in the company of other people. Which one are you going to choose?
Oh, that one has struck a chord. I'd say after my recent trip to India, I would pick 4 hours with other people.
4 hours with other people. I had a sort of inkling that may be the case. But yeah, it's good to have it confirmed. Well, James Benson-King, it has been an absolute pleasure. I know this recording session has been a long time in the making, and I'm so glad we've been finally able to connect properly because I've learnt so much about your journey. You've taken me to your highest of highs and your lowest of lows. We've learnt so much about your reflections from how much you've changed from taking on a journey so vast and so deep, but also stuff that I've learnt about you as well is that adventure focus and goal orientation, the purpose behind you choosing your goal and setting out on your adventure as well. I love that you pack flexibility in with your bag, that you don't try and have things too planned out in detail. And I'm certainly looking forward to watching your Antarctica challenge play out as well. All is to say, thank you so much for sharing your stories and experiences here on the podcast for us all at Seek Travel Ride.
Thank you for having me, Bella.
Well, listeners, I really hope you enjoyed listening to those insights from James's experiences of his huge tour. It is something else, isn't it? When you set yourself a goal and you stick to it and you get yourself to the start line, you get yourself to the end point, but all the adventure is the unknown that happens in between. And I feel like James had to deal with a lot of the unknown all the time. But it sounds like he gained that awareness as he sort of spoke about, just that acceptance of giving things to the universe and finding out a way, finding out how to problem solve. Mind you, between you and I'm not sure how I would go cycling just with my right leg for well over 900 kilometres. And I definitely need to see photos of James's leg and see how that's ended up. I am super keen to see James's future adventures unfold, and I really hope that he gets himself to that goal of cycling across Antarctica and seeing where he gets to from there as well. If you are enjoying Seek Travel Ride and you'd like to help the show out, there's a couple of things you can do. The first one is to make sure you're actually following the show in your podcast player of choice, whether that's Spotify, whether it's Apple, or any of the other pod players. Make sure that you are following the show so you actually get notified of when the new episodes are dropping. I release full-length feature episodes with guests like James each and every week, and midweek we also have little mini bonus episodes where I share excerpts from a listener sharing one day of their trip. And the other thing you can do is tell friends and family about it. Share the show on your social media, share your favourite episode, because chances are your friendship circle is probably into bike adventures as well, and they would too enjoy being a Seek Travel Ride fan. Lastly, if you're all on board with that and you want to be an absolute super fan, feel free to hit the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.